I never thought much about Ethan in that way before. He's always been just my stepson, the boy who wandered into my life when he was only 14. He was awkward back then, still so young, and I couldn't help but treat him like my own son. Over the years, I'd seen him grow up, but it was never anything more than noticing how tall he was getting, or how his voice had dropped a little deeper. But something happened recently, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was subtle at first. One afternoon when we were sitting on the porch, I noticed how his shoulders had filled out, the muscles beginning to show through the sleeves of his t-shirt. I couldn't stop looking at him. It wasn't that I was staring, it wasn't like that, but I realized I couldn't ignore how handsome he had become. His once boyish face had matured into something more striking, more defined. His jawline was sharper, and his eyes, they were different. They seemed older, wiser, like he had seen more of the world than I ever knew. It wasn't just the way he looked, though. Ethan carried himself differently now. He stood taller, walked with more confidence, his steps sure and steady. There was a grace to him now, a self-assuredness I hadn't seen before. Maybe it was just me. Maybe I had never paid close enough attention. But now I couldn't stop noticing. And with each passing day, it felt like that recognition of his transformation was hitting me harder and harder. One evening I was sitting on the couch, lost in a book. Ethan had just come out of the kitchen, his damp hair still wet from the shower, wearing nothing but a pair of gym shorts. He hadn't even noticed me at first, and for a second it was as if time had stopped. I couldn't help but let my eyes drift over him, the way his muscles moved beneath his skin as he reached for the glass of water on the counter. The veins in his arms were more pronounced now, like something out of a magazine. I quickly averted my gaze, embarrassed by the thought that had flashed in my mind. Why was I even thinking like that? He was my stepson, for heaven's sake, but I couldn't deny that my heart had started to race a little. I tried to shake it off, to laugh at myself. "What's wrong with me?" I muttered under my breath. It wasn't the first time I'd noticed how attractive he had become, but it was the first time I truly felt something stir inside me, something I didn't want to acknowledge. It felt wrong, but it also felt real. I'd always been proud of how Ethan had grown up, how he was so kind and thoughtful, and now, well, I didn't know what to make of the feelings bubbling up inside me. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop replaying the image of him in my mind. His face, so handsome now, his body, so much more than just the boy I used to look after. It was almost like I was seeing him for the first time, and the realization hit me like a ton of bricks. Ethan wasn't a boy anymore. He was a man. And I couldn't stop noticing. I tried to convince myself it was just a phase, a momentary lapse, a little slip. It didn't mean anything. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Every time I saw him, I felt that pull, that magnetic force that made it impossible to ignore. His presence in the room seemed to fill every space, making everything else fade into the background. It was a strange and unsettling feeling, one I couldn't shake. But I kept it to myself, of course. No one would understand. And I had to keep a hold of myself, keep things normal. The next morning, as he walked past me in the hallway, I felt that same strange pull. He had on his usual t-shirt and jeans, looking so effortlessly put together, and I couldn't help but notice how well they fit him now. His legs, so strong, so long, caught my attention as he moved. Again, I looked away quickly, trying to distract myself with something else. But the feelings lingered, hovering just under the surface. It wasn't just the physical changes either. There was something in the way he looked at me, something different. I'd always thought he saw me as a second mother, someone to help guide him through life. But lately, there was a hint of something more. Something in his gaze, in the way he'd laugh at my jokes or touch my arm casually when passing by. It was all subtle, but it was there, and I could feel it, a tension building that neither of us had acknowledged yet, but that both of us could sense. I knew I had to be careful. Ethan was still my stepson, and no matter how much he had changed, no matter how attracted I might feel, the boundaries were clear. I couldn't let myself get carried away. But it was hard, so damn hard to ignore what was right in front of me. And as I looked at him across the room that evening, laughing about something trivial, I knew that things had changed, whether I liked it or not. It was one of those ordinary nights, just like any other. Ethan and I had just finished dinner, and we were sitting in the living room watching TV. Alan, my husband, was out on one of his late-night business calls, so it was just the two of us. The house was quiet, the kind of peaceful quiet that felt intimate, yet I tried to ignore the subtle tension building between us. I was trying to relax, to push those unsettling thoughts about Ethan away, but then something happened that would change everything, something that I never saw coming. I had been getting ready for bed, changing into my pajamas in the master bathroom. The door was cracked open just enough to hear the sounds of the TV in the living room, the muffled voices of the characters. I didn't think anything of it when I stepped out into the hallway. My mind was preoccupied, my thoughts still lingering on the day's events. But as soon as I turned the corner, I froze. Ethan was standing right there, just a few feet away from me, his back turned. He had clearly been walking down the hallway, probably heading to the bathroom, but the moment he heard me, he froze too. And in that instant, I realized that I wasn't wearing anything. No shirt, no robe, just my underwear. I hadn't noticed the door open, hadn't realized he was right there. We both stood there for what felt like an eternity, the air thick with embarrassment. His eyes widened in surprise, and I quickly tried to cover myself, my hands instinctively moving to shield my body, even though I knew it was too late. Ethan stammered something, his voice a bit shaky, and quickly turned his head away, not making eye contact. I stood there for a second longer, feeling my heart race, my breath caught in my throat. I felt exposed in a way I had never felt before. "Sorry, I didn't know you were..." Ethan mumbled, but his voice trailed off as he started to walk past me. I couldn't find the right words, didn't know what to say. "It's fine," I said quickly, even though nothing about it felt fine. It was far from fine. My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I had just been caught off guard, caught in the most vulnerable moment imaginable, by my stepson of all people. Ethan disappeared into the bathroom, and I stood there for a few seconds, unsure of what to do. I felt hot, like a wave of heat had washed over me. It wasn't just the awkwardness of the situation that had shaken me. No, it was something deeper, something more complicated. I felt a rush of emotions that I couldn't process. Ethan had just seen me like that, like a woman, not a mother or a stepmother, but a woman. And that thought alone sent a shiver down my spine. I hurried back to my bedroom, closing the door behind me, my hands trembling as I leaned against the doorframe. I tried to steady myself, but my heart was still pounding in my chest. I couldn't shake the image of Ethan's face, his startled eyes, the way he had quickly turned away as if I was something he had never expected to see. There was a moment, a fleeting moment, when I saw something shift in his eyes. It was almost like he had seen me differently, like the woman he had known all these years wasn't the same anymore. It was like something inside him had changed too. The house felt too quiet now. I tried to calm down, telling myself it was just an accident, that it meant nothing. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. We both knew it was more than that. It was as if we had crossed some invisible line, one that neither of us could ignore anymore. Later that night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had just happened. My mind kept replaying that brief moment in the hallway, the look on Ethan's face. It had been an accident, but there was something about it that felt deliberate, almost like it had been waiting to happen. And I wondered as I drifted off to sleep if this was the start of something neither of us could control, something that might change everything. In the days following that awkward encounter, the tension between Ethan and me only seemed to grow. The house felt different, like an invisible weight hung in the air, especially when we were alone together. At first, we tried to act like nothing had happened, but it was impossible to ignore the shift. Every time our paths crossed, I could feel his presence more acutely, like he was somehow more aware of me, more attuned to my every move. And to my surprise, I found myself noticing him in ways I never had before. We spent more time alone together. Ethan would linger in the kitchen when I was cooking, offering to help with little things, his touch brushing against mine more often than necessary. It was subtle, but it was there. I began to realize that I wasn't just seeing him as my stepson anymore. Something had changed in the way I looked at him. He wasn't just the young man who lived under my roof. He had become someone I couldn't seem to stop thinking about. He was growing into himself, his broad shoulders, the confidence in his eyes. The way his muscles moved when he did something as simple as picking up a glass or reaching for something on a high shelf. I couldn't help but notice how he had become so strong, so masculine. And it wasn't just his appearance. The more we talked, the more I saw how much he had matured. His humor, his opinions, the way he shared pieces of his life with me, it all drew me in. He wasn't the same boy who used to sit at the dinner table awkwardly. Now, he spoke with confidence, with a sense of purpose. He wasn't just looking for approval from me or anyone else. He was becoming his own person. And in those quiet moments, when he'd share something personal or talk about his dreams, I realized how much I was starting to admire him. One evening after dinner, we sat together in the living room, just the two of us. Alan had gone out to grab something from the store, and the house was peaceful. The TV was on, but neither of us was really watching it. We were talking, really talking, for the first time in a while. Ethan opened up about his future, about his career plans, and the struggles he faced trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. I was surprised by his vulnerability, how much he trusted me with his thoughts. "I don't really know where I'm headed, you know," he said, his voice soft but earnest. "Everyone keeps telling me I need to have it all figured out by now, but I don't. I'm just trying to find my way." I found myself listening intently, almost holding my breath. There was something about the way he spoke, the sincerity in his words, that made me see him in a new light. He wasn't just a young man who had grown up under my roof. He was becoming someone I could relate to, someone I could understand on a deeper level. And I didn't want to admit it, but a part of me felt proud of him, proud of the person he was becoming. He looked over at me, catching my eye, and for a brief moment, there was an unspoken understanding between us. I could tell that he saw me differently too. It was in the way he looked at me, no longer just as his stepmother, but as a woman. I felt it in the way he spoke, in the way his body language changed when he was near me. "I'm glad you're here, Sarah," he said softly, his voice lower than usual. "You've always been there for me." The words lingered in the air, and for a split second, I felt a wave of warmth wash over me. But it wasn't just a motherly warmth. It was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to face. I quickly shifted the conversation, but deep down I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more between us now. It wasn't just the growing attraction I felt toward him. It was the emotional intimacy, the way we were connecting on a level I hadn't expected. From that night forward, things only got more complicated. I found myself wanting to be around him more. I started seeking out those quiet moments alone with him, whether it was while doing the dishes, folding laundry, or just sitting together on the porch watching the sunset. Our conversations became more personal, more revealing, and as we shared these moments, I felt a growing closeness that was both comforting and unsettling. The line between motherly affection and something deeper was blurring, and neither of us knew how to stop it. It was as if we were both caught in this web of attraction, drawn to each other without fully understanding why or how it was happening. I tried to convince myself that it was just a phase, that these feelings would pass, but I knew deep down that it wasn't that simple. It was real, and it was only getting stronger. As the days passed, the air between Ethan and me became charged with something more than just simple attraction. It wasn't just the way he looked at me now. It was the little things, the gestures that started to feel different. His glances lingered just a bit longer than they used to, as though he were trying to say something without words. He would catch my eye across the room, a small, knowing smile curling at the corners of his mouth, and I would feel my heart skip a beat. It was subtle but undeniable. At dinner, when he'd hand me a plate or pass the salt, his fingers would brush against mine, lingering for just a fraction of a second too long. I noticed it more and more, and each time I felt a jolt of electricity shoot through me. It was the kind of touch that was both accidental and intentional at the same time. It made my skin prickle with awareness, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was testing the waters, seeing how far he could go without crossing a line. Ethan wasn't shy about offering compliments either, something I'd never really noticed before. "You look really good today, Sarah," he'd say casually, as though it was no big deal. But the way he said it, the tone of his voice, made it sound more meaningful than it should have been. And the more he did it, the more it seemed like he was giving me permission to see him as something more than just my stepson. He didn't say it outright, but the implication was there. I couldn't help but feel that he was letting me know that he saw me in a new light too. I'd catch him watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his gaze lingering on me as I moved around the house. It was the kind of look that made my stomach twist with something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't just admiration, it was something deeper, more intense. And I started to wonder if he was feeling what I was feeling. One evening, after a long day of running errands, I came home tired and worn out, my mind on a million other things. Ethan was already home, and when I walked into the living room, he was sitting on the couch, his feet propped up on the coffee table, his shirt slightly rumpled from a long day. There was something about the way he looked at me then, a softness in his eyes that wasn't there before. He didn't say anything at first, but his gaze held mine longer than usual, as though he was studying me, trying to figure me out. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice gentle but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I nodded, a little too quickly, trying to brush off the way my heart had started to race. "Yeah, just a long day, nothing a cup of tea can't fix." But as I turned to walk into the kitchen, I could feel his eyes on me, and for the first time, it didn't make me uncomfortable. It made me feel seen. He wasn't just looking at me anymore. He was looking at me with a sense of understanding, like he knew me in a way no one else did. And it felt like more than just the natural closeness that came with living under the same roof. It was something more intimate, something that made my pulse quicken every time our eyes met. I couldn't help but wonder if he realized what was happening between us. Was he testing me, seeing how far he could push before I would stop him? Or was it just me, reading too much into small gestures, overthinking every little thing? Either way, the tension was undeniable. It was in the way he touched me, the way he spoke to me, the way his gaze held mine just a moment too long. And as much as I tried to ignore it, I could feel the pull between us growing stronger. The lines were becoming blurred, and it was getting harder and harder to tell where the boundaries were. Every subtle hint, every lingering touch made it more difficult to deny the attraction that was building between us. It was a feeling I couldn't escape, no matter how hard I tried. It was a quiet evening, the kind of night when the house was still, and the world outside felt like it was miles away. The last rays of sunlight were fading, casting a soft glow through the window, and I found myself alone in the living room, sipping on a glass of wine. Ethan was in the kitchen, rummaging through the fridge, making himself a snack. We'd been spending more time together recently, and the comfort of his presence was starting to feel like a familiar, even welcome, part of my routine. I was lost in thought when he walked in, his footsteps light on the hardwood floor. He looked different tonight. There was something more serious about him, a tension in the way he held himself. His usual casual smile was absent, replaced by an intensity that caught my attention immediately. "Sarah, can we talk?" His voice was quieter than usual, almost hesitant, as though he was weighing his words carefully. I turned my head to look at him, noting how his expression was suddenly more guarded, his brows furrowed slightly. There was something in his eyes that I couldn't quite place, something raw, vulnerable. I set my glass down on the coffee table, my pulse quickening. "Of course. What's on your mind?" He hesitated for a moment, then walked over to the couch, sitting down next to me. He didn't immediately meet my gaze, his fingers fidgeting with the hem of his shirt, his body language tense. It was rare for him to act like this, and it unsettled me. "I don't really know how to say this," he started, his voice quieter now, almost a whisper. "But I think I've been feeling something for you for a while now." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but my heart was racing. He was sitting so close to me, his presence overwhelming. My mind was spinning, but I couldn't move. I needed to understand what he was saying. "Ethan, what are you—" He cut me off, his gaze finally meeting mine, and the intensity in his eyes made it hard to breathe. "I know this is complicated. I know it shouldn't be happening, but I can't help how I feel. Every time I see you, every time I'm around you, it's like I can't control it anymore." His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and I could see the pain behind his admission. I swallowed hard, my throat dry, as I tried to process his words. My first instinct was to push him away, to tell him that this was wrong, that we couldn't cross that line. But the truth was, hearing him say it aloud, hearing him admit it, felt like something shifted between us. Like an invisible wall had been taken down. "I never wanted this," he continued, his voice trembling now. "But I can't keep pretending that I don't feel this pull toward you." His words hung in the air, heavy and raw, and I felt the weight of them settle in my chest. I didn't know how to respond. I couldn't even begin to process the flood of emotions that were rushing through me. Part of me wanted to reach out to him, to tell him that I felt something too. But the rational side of my brain screamed that this was wrong. This was my stepson. I had no business feeling the way I did, no right to even entertain the idea that there could be anything between us. But there was another part of me, a quieter, more dangerous part that wanted to admit what I had been trying to deny. The way he looked at me, the way his presence made me feel. It wasn't just a motherly bond. It was something deeper, something more intimate. And the more I tried to suppress it, the more I realized that the feelings were mutual. I cleared my throat, trying to find my voice. "Ethan, He leaned forward, his eyes searching mine with an intensity that sent a shiver down my spine. "I'm not expecting anything from you, Sarah. I just needed you to know how I feel. And if you don't feel the same way, I'll understand." But I couldn't keep hiding it. The room was thick with tension, and for a moment, all I could do was sit there, my mind racing with thoughts I couldn't articulate. Ethan was waiting for me to respond, his breath coming a little quicker as he watched me, unsure of how I would react. And in that moment, everything changed. The dynamic between us had shifted irrevocably. We were no longer just a woman and her stepson. We were two people who had crossed a line, whether we acknowledged it or not. And everything from that moment on would be different. The days that followed Ethan's confession were the most unnerving of my life. We both knew that things couldn't go back to how they were before. Our interactions, once casual and full of family ease, had become laden with unspoken tension. I could feel it every time our eyes met, an electric current so intense that it seemed to pulse between us. It was like we were walking on a tightrope, each step a little closer to falling, but neither of us willing to turn back. I tried to focus on keeping things normal, pretending that nothing had changed. We still sat down for family dinners, still talked about trivial things, work, the weather, the same old topics we had covered 100 times. But it was all surface level, a thin veneer over something much deeper, much more dangerous. I couldn't ignore the way Ethan's presence seemed to fill the room in a way it never had before. I couldn't escape the feeling that, at any moment, something was going to crack and everything would spill over. One evening, as I was folding laundry in the living room, I felt Ethan standing just behind me. The air in the room shifted when I realized he hadn't made a sound coming in. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around, meeting his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. His gaze was enough to communicate everything. There was hunger in it, a longing that mirrored my own. It was a silent exchange, a mutual recognition that we were both caught in the same web of desire. But it wasn't just the attraction that scared me. It was the sense of inevitability that hung in the air. We both knew that our connection was pushing boundaries, and I could feel the weight of that knowledge pressing down on me with each passing moment. I tried to distance myself, tried to fill my time with distractions, but there were too many moments, too many accidental touches, too many lingering glances. One afternoon, as I was walking past him on my way to the kitchen, his hand brushed against my arm, sending a jolt through me. I pulled away instinctively, but not quickly enough. My pulse hammered in my chest, my body betraying me. And then there were the conversations, the ones that started innocently enough but always ended up with a dangerous edge. Ethan would lean in just a little closer, his voice dropping lower as if sharing a secret meant just for me. I had to remind myself, over and over, that this wasn't right. I wasn't supposed to feel this way. He was my stepson, for God's sake. But every time I told myself to pull away, to set boundaries, I felt that same pull again. It was like a magnetic force, drawing me in despite all the logic and reason that told me to resist. I could see it in his eyes. He was caught in the same struggle, torn between wanting to break free and knowing that doing so would destroy everything. And yet, neither of us could stop. The line had already been crossed, and there was no way to go back. The more we resisted, the more the tension built. and I could feel it tightening around us like a noose. We were both standing on the edge, and every interaction brought us a little closer to the point of no return. I knew that this was dangerous ground that we were both willingly stepping onto, knowing full well the consequences. But there was something about the way Ethan looked at me, something in the way his presence wrapped itself around me, that made it impossible to turn away. We were both trapped in the same game, and the stakes were higher than either of us could have imagined. The reality of the situation was becoming clear to me, and it scared me more than anything else. What were we doing? What would happen if anyone found out? The consequences of our actions weighed heavily on my mind, but despite the fear, despite the guilt that gnawed at me, I couldn't stop myself. Neither of us could. And with every passing day, I knew we were getting closer to a breaking point. It felt like the walls were closing in around us. Every minute spent with Ethan, every glance, every touch, seemed to heighten the danger we were living in. The tension between us had become unbearable, and I could see it in his eyes. He was growing frustrated. His desire was clear, his impatience undeniable, but it was more than that. There was something desperate in the way he would look at me, a plea for something more, something that neither of us could give voice to. I couldn't deny the pull between us, but with every passing day I grew more afraid of what it would mean if we crossed that line, what it would mean for us, for the family, for everything I had worked so hard to build. I could feel the weight of the secret bearing down on me, my guilt suffocating me in moments when I was alone. But with Ethan, I could almost forget. When he was near, everything else faded into the background. But that wasn't enough for him anymore. The pressure had been building for weeks, and finally one night it exploded. We were sitting on the couch, watching some old movie, the kind that neither of us was paying much attention to. I could feel his body inches away from mine, the heat radiating between us. The air was thick with tension, the kind that's almost suffocating, the kind that makes you wonder if you've waited too long to turn away. Then, without warning, he spoke. His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a knife. I can't keep doing this, Sarah. This thing between us, it's driving me crazy. I froze, unsure of how to respond. My heart started racing, my breath caught in my throat. I wasn't sure if I was more scared of what he might say next, or of what I might say. The words I had been avoiding, the words I feared, were finally coming to the surface. Ethan, I started, my voice shaking despite my best efforts to keep it steady. We can't, but he wasn't listening. He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, and his hand reached out to gently cup my cheek. My breath hitched, and I could see the hunger in his eyes, the same hunger that had been building between us for so long. He looked at me like he didn't care anymore, like he was ready to cross that line, no matter the consequences. Sarah, I can't stop thinking about you, he said softly, almost pleading. I know it's wrong, but I can't help it. I need to know if you feel the same way. My mind was spinning. Everything in me screamed to pull away, to stop this before it went any further, but I couldn't move. My body was frozen in place, a part of me wanting to escape, but another part, the part that had been fighting this for so long, suddenly craved it. His touch, his words, it all felt like something I couldn't control anymore. I don't know what to say, I whispered, barely able to form the words. Ethan's hand slid down to my neck, his thumb brushing against my skin as he held me there, his breath hot against my face. His closeness, his intensity, it was too much. My chest tightened, my heart pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I just want to know, Sarah. Do you want this too? I was trapped, caught between fear and desire, caught between what was right and what felt so damn wrong but so impossible to resist. I could feel myself breaking under the pressure, every part of me screaming for release, but also terrified of what would happen if I gave in. The room felt smaller, the space between us disappearing. I could feel the decision hanging in the air, the point of no return, and I knew, with every fiber of my being, that once we crossed it, there would be no going back. The next few days passed in a blur of confusion and fear. I could hardly think straight. Every time Ethan was near, the weight of our unspoken connection crushed me. His presence was electric, the tension between us palpable, but the fear of what it would mean if we gave in, it consumed me. I kept replaying his words in my mind, his confession, the intensity in his eyes when he asked if I felt the same. I tried to distance myself, to bury it deep down and pretend that nothing had changed. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't ignore it anymore. Ethan's every movement, every word, seemed to pull me deeper into something I couldn't escape. I wanted to scream at myself, to slap some sense into my own mind. But every time I looked at him, all the logical reasoning slipped away. It was the last night before everything changed. Ethan and I were alone again, and the air felt thick with the unspoken. I knew this was it, the point where everything would either fall apart or shift into something we couldn't control. We sat on the porch, the night air cool against my skin, and he turned to me, his gaze steady but full of something that made my heart skip a beat. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at me, his eyes searching mine like he was looking for something. Maybe an answer, maybe reassurance, or maybe he was waiting for me to make the choice for both of us. I opened my mouth to speak, but the words stuck. What could I say? How could I justify any of this? My mind raced, a whirlwind of guilt and longing, of fear and desire all tangled together. Ethan. My voice was barely a whisper, but I could see him lean in, as if every part of him was waiting for me to say the words. I swallowed hard. I don't know if we should do this. I don't know if I'm strong enough to resist, but I also don't know how to keep going, pretending like this isn't happening. He reached for my hand, his fingers warm against mine. I'm not asking you to pretend, Sarah. I just need to know, do you want me to, or do you want me to walk away? It was a simple question, but it felt like the heaviest one I'd ever faced. I could feel my breath catch in my throat. The weight of the decision was crushing, and I knew that whatever I decided, nothing would ever be the same again. Ethan was right. It wasn't about pretending anymore. It was about confronting the truth of what we both wanted, and the consequences of giving into it. I could feel my chest tightening, my heart pounding, and I knew that what I said next would decide everything. Would I choose to stay in the safety of what I knew, the safety of what was right? Or would I give in to the dangerous, thrilling connection between us? I closed my eyes for a moment, as if trying to block out everything around me. Then, with a deep breath, I made my choice. I hesitated, my fingers tightening around his. I want you, Ethan. I want this, even though it scares me, even though I know how wrong it is. But I want you. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled me toward him, his lips crashing against mine in a kiss that was full of desperation and relief, as if we had both been holding our breath, waiting for this moment. The world around us faded, and all that mattered in that moment was the choice we had made. There was no turning back now, but as his arms wrapped around me, I couldn't shake the feeling that our decision, no matter how right it felt in the moment, would carry consequences that would haunt us forever.